Hello, everyone. This is Eva Nolik-Smith with YogaUOnline, and I am very pleased to be here today with yoga teacher and yoga therapist, Kristine Kaoverii Weber. Kristine is particularly well known in the yoga community for her commitment to getting yoga adapted as a part of the public health strategies for enhancing public health in this country, which is not a small goal. And we commend you for that. And to that end, Kristine, I believe you created one of the first yoga teacher trainings for behavioral health professionals in Asheville, North Carolina. And through your organization, Subtle Health, you train yoga teacher trainings as well as mind-body training and clinical services for the purposes of enhancing community health infrastructure. So Kristine, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Eva. It's always nice to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for all the great work you're doing and your brilliance in always kind of exploring new ways that yoga can be applied to enhancing health, and also how the wisdom of yoga integrates with cutting edge Western knowledge, which is very exciting.
Yeah, it's what's exciting, so exciting to me, is to see how science is catching up with yoga.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I wanted to talk to you today about detoxification. We're in the winter months, and generally speaking, we start thinking a lot more about detoxification because we're not moving very much. And it's kind of a curious thing to me that we hear so much about nutrition and the importance of what to eat. And, you know, take these supplements and do this and do that, don't eat that. But we don't really hear that much about detoxification. And we all know that the body has a number of ongoing detoxification functions that are essential. Yeah. We never really pay attention to our detoxification system unless, like, we have a kidney failure or the liver develops problems and so on and so forth. So does that mean that there really isn't anything we can do to optimize our detoxification functions and just kind of don't need to pay attention to them?
Well, you know, there is this whole movement in the scientific yoga community about how we can't really detox with yoga. And to an extent, I think that's accurate from a Western medical paradigm, you know, so like your body is always doing this process of releasing toxins. And then yoga people will say things like, well, sweat your toxins out or whatever. And yeah, that's inaccurate. We don't sweat our toxins out. We mostly sweat out water. Toxins have to go through a process and they mostly leave through, you know, the normal routes of urination and defecation. So that's accurate. However, if you're using a different paradigm, if you're using a yogic chikitsa, yoga therapy, or an Ayurvedic paradigm, there's a long tradition in that paradigm of using different practices and creating an optimal environment for releasing toxins from your system. So it may not be that you sweat out your toxins, but you can support the process of releasing toxins from the system, and toxins do create a heavy burden on the system. And that's well known from the Western medical perspective, well known, you know, not toxins in terms of pollution and dangerous substances, as I've seen them called in research articles, and also toxins from the perspective of toxic stress. And so the endogenous toxins in the system too. And so there's numerous practices that have been around for hundreds of years, if not longer, from the yoga tradition that are supportive in that process of cleansing the body. And I would say, in fact, you know, the Hatha yoga tradition really is a tradition of cleansing. You know, when you look at the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, part of the whole process is to purify the body with the intention of using that to purify the subtle body, to purify the mind, to purify the soul, you know, to move through all the koshas of self. You know, people can, throughout the years, throughout the centuries, people have been too extreme about those cleansing practices, you know, and then, or else we've ignored those cleansing practices. But I think it's worth having a look into what detoxification means to, you know, in terms of the tradition, not just in terms of Western medicine, but in terms of the yoga tradition, and then experimenting with some of those practices and see how they work for you. I mean, I think that I think they're low risk for the most part. And, you know, I'm not talking about the swallowing the gauze or, you know, drinking copious amounts of water and vomiting. I'm not talking about that stuff. I'm talking about some simple practices that I think can be really beneficial and very, very much do facilitate the process of reducing the toxic load in the system.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, I mean, we're all familiar with toxins coming from the outside, environmental toxins, and we're familiar with the, you know, byproducts of stress, high stress levels like cortisol and so on, being issues that can burden the system and need to kind of be, you know, we need to remove it through various detoxification processes. But I think just the normal natural metabolism of the body, taking in food and recycling it into energy and then eliminating it, just the side products of the cellular metabolism and all the different processes of metabolism are not always as effective as they need to be. There could be, you know,
right,
different seasons impacted, the degree of movement we get impacted, you know, detoxification functions of the body. Our age impacts the detoxification level of the body. And so it just seems like in the same way as we're conscious about how we can optimize our nutritional status, we really need to also pay attention to how can we enhance all those natural functions that are happening, but not necessarily always with the best efficiency.
Yes, I totally agree. And, you know, I think we live in a consumer culture. And so we focus on the consumption part of our lives, not necessarily on the letting go part of our lives. You know, that part is tricky. But for a lot of people, because why do we consume and why do we, of course we consume because it's a biological imperative, but we also consume oftentimes out of psychological needs that remain challenging, elusive to fulfill, particularly in an isolating culture, you know, so looking through the biopsychosocial spiritual spheres of existence and not just focusing on what goes in and what comes out from a biomechanical perspective. You know, is that the right word? Biomechanical, from a biological perspective, you know? Right. So I think that that's something that we have to, that we have to take into consideration too. Like why is it difficult to let go in our culture? You know, why is it difficult to let go of things? So as I mentioned, there's these different layers of the self, according to the yoga tradition, right? It comes from the Taittiriya Upanishad, these koshas or layers of the self. And so it's not just about detoxifying from the physical layer of the self. And in fact, you could argue that detoxifying from those deeper layers of the self will reverberate into the physical structure as well. So, you know, we're not cars. We're not this mechanistic idea of calories in, calories out, or what goes in, what comes out. We're not a car, you know, we're complex. Right. We are complex social creatures that live, you know, in community, in nested systems of being. And because of that complexity, we have to consider all the layers of ourselves when we're talking about detoxification, not just this very sort of reductive Western idea of what goes in and what comes out.
Right. So that's a really, really interesting point. So you're really, like, if we talk about the body as in terms of the kosha as the different sheets of the body, and we have the physical body, the prana body, the mental body, the wisdom body, the bliss body. So you're saying that what we really should be paying attention to is detoxification on multiple levels.
Yes. I mean, again, if you want to talk about detoxification, I think it's worthwhile to use a yogic and an Ayurvedic framework for that, because the Western framework is not as efficient in terms of the practices, right? So that makes sense, first of all. If you're going to use a yogic and an Ayurvedic framework, then it makes sense to look at causality, and it makes sense to look at the causal flow. And you can start with the shariras, and I'll talk about this in the workshop, but it means like you can look at who am I as a human being and how do I heal? Because that's the model, right? So whatever technique you're using needs to have a model to back it up. And so in yoga, what we have are these models from the Upanishad, and there's models from Sankhya, there's models from these different philosophical schools, and the practices are they work in tangent, they work in they work within the framework of those models. So it makes sense to me that you're going to look at the causal flow of what we are as human beings. And according to the tradition, what we are as human beings is, essentially spirit that has manifested in matter. And quantum physics, helps us to understand this. Although I only know enough about quantum physics to be dangerous, but not in a nuclear kind of way. But I mean, basically it says that, mind and matter, there's a relationship. They're not these separate things. There's a relationship between mind and matter. There's an interconnectedness. If we see ourselves as human beings, as coming into being from this spirit realm, then it makes sense that we have to look deeper into ourselves to find the mechanisms for health and healing that lie beyond this physical, this physical body, or this reductive perspective. So we do have to go deeper. We have to look, let's look at the prana body. How can we use pranic practices like pranayama, like breath-centered asanas? How do we use those practices to make shifts in the pranic body? How do we use the practices of yoga, the cognitive practices that largely have come to us like via the Yoga Sutras, for example? How do we use those practices to make shifts in the manomaya kosha and the mental layer? And, and then again, how do we go deeper into practices that sing to our heart, that touch the Anandamaya, the Vijnanamaya, the Anandamaya parts of ourselves, that touch those deeper wisdom parts of ourselves, in order to let those shifts reverberate into the coarser layers of self. And that's, right. I think we have to look at it from that perspective. Otherwise, right. We will get criticized by the Western paradigm people, because they say, oh, that's just, that's just foo-foo, woo-woo, Asheville sort of, garbagey stuff that doesn't make any sense in terms of science. Well, it depends on what your scientific paradigm is, I would suggest.
Yeah, that's a good point. So just to take an example of what detoxification, for example, on the level of the mind would look like, there's a lot of talk about the importance of things like forgiveness and gratitude exercises. Is that a form of detoxification, letting go on the level of the mind of stuff that doesn't serve you anymore? Or what, can you give us some examples of what exactly detoxification on the level of the manomaya kosha would look like?
Right. So, I mean, I think there's lots of ways you can do it. Like the things you were suggesting, for example, gratitude practices, compassion practices, those things largely come from Buddhist traditions. There's plenty of things in the tantric traditions as well. And mantra meditation, because, as you think, so you become. So you start to shift the mind through mantra meditations. There's plenty of cognitive practices in the Yoga Sutras. For example, Vishokava Jyotishmati, where when you're challenged by a difficult thought, that you should think about its opposite. That's a proto-cognitive behavioral therapy, essentially. I think the tradition is full of kind of cognitive practices, but let's remember that what the scientists say is 80 to 95% of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors largely lie beneath the level of consciousness. So that means if we want to detoxify the manomaya kosha, the mind, we're going to have to find ways to allow some of that unconscious stuff to bubble up into consciousness, or we use the front brain to create feedback loops into the body so that the body starts to shift the way that it's organized, and then create shifts in the brain. So, and how do we do that? Well, we use practices like legs up the wall to create a shift in the autonomic nervous system, and then that percolates up into the front brain, and I'm not as stressed out as I've been, you know. Then that's just a very basic example, but
right.
You know, we constantly in yoga, we constantly are using both top down and bottom up self-regulation strategies, so we can be conscious about that, you know, and feedback loops. It's not just one way or the other way.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And to just make sure that it's really clear, why don't you elaborate a little bit on the top-down, bottom-up self-care strategies or yogic strategies, because that's such a great point.
Sure. So, well, you know, so that's from neuroscience. You have, it's basically about neuropsychology, neuropsychiatry. So how do you self-regulate? You know, self-regulation is the process of homeostasis, right? Becoming balanced. Patanjali said, yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Everybody knows that yoga is the process of, you know, the ceasing of the fluctuations of the mind. Well, why do you want to do that? Well, the idea is because that creates homeostasis. And that's because the next sutra is tada drastu swarupe avastanam, right? Which means that because through that process, then you can see who you truly are. But you can't see who you are. You don't have a sense of your identity until you can find homeostasis in the nervous system, in the system, right? So we find homeostasis. How do we find homeostasis? So essentially the neuroscientists say we have two directions. One is front brain, using affirmation, positive affirmations, cognitive reframing, all those wonderful aspects of executive function like rational decision making. We use that stuff to percolate down and create, you know, control. So it's like the parent controlling the dysregulated child. You can think about it that way. But since we know that so many of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are below the level of this, we also have to have these strategies. And I like to call them, and they're bottom-up strategies, but I like to call them body-up too. The neuroscientists talk about it in terms of the brainstem. So the brainstem, the brainstem is controlling things like your breathing rate and your heart rate and your temperature. So hormone, well, it's interfacing with the limbic system, but hormones. So how do we get into that stuff? You know, how do I get into that? Well, we have the breath. That's the one autonomic function we can take conscious control over. So that gives us a little window into the autonomic nervous system and into self-regulating the body, right? And then we have the baroreflex, which is the starting to make shifts in the blood pressure depending on where your body is in space, right? So then we have yoga asana practices. We have all these different practices that start to affect the baroreflex. Again, the bottom up, it's a bottom up process, but we're using the front brain to make the bottom up happen. So it's always feedback loops, you know.
Right.
So those are basic ideas in the neuroscience world of top down and bottom up, and yoga uses both of them all the time, particularly if you define yoga as the 4 process tools of ethics, ethical engagement, which again, powerful cognitive strategy for self-regulation, and then asanas, and then pranayama, and then meditation, right? If you have that holistic, systemic perspective on the practices, and you have that whole toolbox, then you know what you're going to be able to use to help create balance, or you at least have, you know, a good ballpark that some things are going to work and some things aren't going to work as well. And I have lots of options.
Yeah. Excellent point. And just getting back to detoxification on the level of the physical body, most of us, tend to think about heavy duty cleanses like fasting or drinking lemon water or taking purgative laxatives.
Panchakarma, right?
Panchakarma. But yoga also has this simple concept of, yoga asana as a path to detoxification. And
Sure.
And you made reference a bit in the beginning to the controversy about the benefits of yoga for detoxification, because yes, a lot of people say, well, saying that, for example, twisting postures are helping detoxifying the body, that's an exaggerated claim that is not founded in science.
Yeah.
However, my understanding of that statement is really that twisting postures can help enhance the detoxification processes, the natural functions in the body that do various detoxification functions. Is that your understanding also? And if so, how would that come about? How would twisting postures, for example, have an effect like that?
So I agree with your sentiments about that there has been this sort of swing of the pendulum to the other side of like, no, twist postures don't detoxify you. That's not science, And before it was just like, the teacher said twist poses are detoxifying. Now we have this era of the internet. There's no research that I know of that says about a twist pose helping to detoxify your body. So these are a good point. Like, it's good for us to use our jnana shakti, our desire for knowledge, and to use our critical thinking skills to suss out whether or not this stuff is accurate. I totally understand that and value that. And then there's the issue that we tend, because we're Westerners, we swim around in this thinking structure that we're not even aware of. It's like a fish swimming in water and not being aware of the water. And so part of the thinking structure that we swim around in is this idea that postures are like pills. If I'm toxic and I have liver disease, I'll do a twist pose. Or if I, whatever you hear, like, oh, if I have anxiety, I'll do a forward bend. You hear those kinds of ideas, and it's because of our tendency as Western people or Eastern people that bought into the Western paradigms, the Western scientific materialism paradigms. It's because of our tendencies to want to know through a reductive analysis that we bump up against these issues, So of course there's no research on Matsyendra asana fixing your liver. Like maybe eventually we'll get to that place. But how do you contextualize Matsyendra asana? Even the claims really defy the scientific method. This, like, you can't really do an RCT on Matsyendra asana, a randomized control trial. Like, how do you do that? So how do you contextualize what you're doing with a twist? And are you using it in a way that helps to create a massage in the internal organs that creates more of a soothing feeling to the nervous system, or a soothing bias to the nervous system that maybe starts to shift some of the subluxations in the spine to shift what's going on in the nerve? There's so many possibilities of what that posture could be doing and how it could be beneficial.
The old squeeze and soak principle, I think, applies.
That squeeze and soak thing, it's a metaphor. So if we can look at things like, okay, metaphorically, there's something interesting there, then we don't have to have this sort of hard, rigid attitude like, no, the yogis were wrong. These practices are perennial. They've been around for thousands of years. They've helped millions of people. So, I don't think we have to be so rigid about it. I'm not claiming that I can, that I can adhere to a Western scientific framework in these claims. And I would also suggest that the Western scientific medical model is largely insufficient when it comes to treating most of the chronic diseases that plague our culture. And therefore, if we have other possibilities and things that can be helpful for people, practices, frameworks, theoretical frameworks, models, then why not look to that if we're going to help alleviate suffering? So I think we have to be really careful with this conversation and we have to be very careful about not making superlative, hyperbolic claims about yoga. And at the same time, we all see it. I mean, you just have to go teach a class and everybody's like, oh my God, I feel so much better. So, you know, it does work, but we don't necessarily have subtle enough tools yet to measure the effectiveness or measure the mechanisms of how it works.
I think, though, in terms of understanding possible mechanisms, there's one thing that both Western science and yogic science agrees on, and that's the importance of circulation. That
circulation.
Circulation is, you know, in the Western science framework, you know, it's the flow of lymph, it's the flow of blood, it's the flow of nerve information. And when circulation gets, you know, impeded in one area of the body, problems arise. And yoga has the same concept in terms of, you know, the many numerous different channels through which subtle energy flows, the nadis.
In Dhyana Vayu.
Yeah. And so you can say that a simple framework for understanding how yoga poses could help facilitate detoxification is by enhancing circulation, removing stagnation, helping the body get rid of waste toxins, waste products from the cellular metabolism by, you know, making us move and be in postures and challenge the body in ways we don't usually challenge it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great point. And I think it's just a tiny little peek behind the curtain of what's going on biopsychosocially when we practice, you know, because there's social engagement stuff going on that's affecting the nervous system. There's movement that's affecting the nervous system, the circulatory system, the respiratory system, the immune system. I mean, the hormonal system, all of that stuff is being affected. But as I said, perhaps the tools of science aren't subtle enough to really be able to measure this stuff yet, you know. But that doesn't, just because we can't measure it yet doesn't mean it's not valid and it's not happening.
Right.
That we are doing something that's maybe on the experimental fringe. And if you are the kind of person who has the mindset of just like, I only want to do what's evidence-based, that's fine. There's plenty of evidence-based stuff going on out there too in the yoga world. Do that, you know. So good. I think we're in these waters that are difficult to navigate at this point, but experientially, empirically, there's evidence, you know, there's people have experiences, and many people have changed many health conditions by using these practices. Yeah,
very good point. Great. Last but not least, you have a course on YogaU about this topic, applying yoga for facilitating detoxification in the body. Could you tell us a little bit more about the course and what you'll be covering?
Sure. So I'm really excited. Thank you for asking me to do this course. And it's gonna be 2 webinars, and then there are 6 short practices. So the practices are about reducing, the first one is about reducing ama, which is an Ayurvedic term for toxins. So reducing the toxic load in the system. The second one is about improving the digestive fire, the agni. The third one is about harnessing the digestive power of the relaxation response. The fourth one is about promoting natural detoxifying processes with yoga. The 5th practice is about the pranic body, detoxifying the energy body. And then the 6-week practice is about detoxifying the mind and diminishing that urge to retox. Sometimes people are into the detox-retox thing. So why do we get toxic in the first place? Now, of course, not much of that toxicity is around environmental toxins. So it's not just, you know, because we're doing bad things, but there's that too. So addressing that. And then the lectures, we'll kind of break those down into two areas. So we'll be looking at, looking at the nervous system, looking at toxins in the body, or what we could call endogenous toxins. We'll also look at exogenous toxins. So what comes into us from outside. And then of course the big emphasis is on what practices can be useful to create more homeostasis, to let go of what needs to be released and then create better homeostasis in the entire system. So I think that's a kind of a basic rundown.
Right.
There's anything else I'm missing from that?
Yeah, no, very, very interesting. I particularly the concept of ama, I think, is such a great universal description for, I guess, what Ayurveda considers the origin of most diseases. Is that correct?
That's what they say in Ayurveda, yeah, that it's the origin of most of our diseases, and it creates a heavy burden on the system, and not just on the physical body, but also on the mind. So we will talk about some like daily, sometimes people call it dinacharya, these sort of like daily yoga lifestyle practices that can be really helpful for, reducing that load. But not excessively, because you do have to be careful of this idea of excessive detoxing. It's not healthy. It takes you into a place of vulnerability in some ways, for some people in their constitutions. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, for sure. Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And I will very much look forward to your course.
Yeah, me too, Eva. It's so nice to see you.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Okay.
Namaste.